4 different US states all claim to be the most mountainous, and they're all kind of correct, based on how you choose to define the question. And so today I want to talk about what's going on here, why Alaska, Colorado, West Virginia, and Nevada all hold a legitimate claim to being the most mountainous state in America. But before I do that, I want to be a little transparent about who I am and where I'm coming at this from. I have personally lived in the Sierra Nevadas, the Rocky Mountains, and the Appalachians. I am not a geologist or a land surveyor or really qualified to talk about this at all, but I have a deep understanding and appreciation for how important mountains are to the people who live in them. They provide resources and tourism revenue, and they create the backdrop of our lives. Mountains are a tremendous source of pride to the people who live in them, and I want to talk about that, starting with Alaska. Alaska's gonna be pretty quick because it's the most straightforward. Alaska has the most mountains total of any state in the US. Nearly 4,000 of those mountains have names, and Denali is the tallest mountain in the United States, with its summit reaching over 20,000 feet, or a little over 6,000 meters. But Alaska is also huge, being the largest US state and nearly a quarter the size of the continental US. And so it stands to reason that, given the largest state is also a mountainous one, that it would have the most mountains total by extension. However, there are plenty of flat and lowland parts of Alaska too, especially north of the Arctic Circle and between mountain ranges along the Pacific coast. And so because of that, it only ranks 15th in terms of mean elevation overall, being behind states like Nebraska, Kansas, and South Dakota, which aren't really famous for having mountains at all. He says as if the most famous thing in South Dakota isn't a mountain. But I digress. I want to use the idea of mean elevation as a way to segue into talking about Colorado. Colorado has the highest mean elevation of any state in the US, with its average elevation being 6,000 feet, or about 2,070 meters. Because Colorado has the highest mean elevation, it's often the state that shows up first when you Google search, what's the most mountainous state in America? But there's just one problem with this. Elevation does not equal mountains. Nebraska and Kansas both have higher mean elevations than Alaska, but neither of those states have any mountains really at all. And an entire half of the state of Colorado is completely flat, including the space where the Denver metropolitan area sits. Flying into Denver is a radically different visual experience than flying into places like Salt Lake City or Reno, which are also cities famous for their proximity to skiing. And so a lot of people who aren't really familiar with the Western US find themselves confused or disappointed when they fly into Denver and realize that the mountains are still quite a ways away. Calgary has sort of the same thing going on when you go up to Alberta to visit Banff. And that's because the thing about North America in general is that your elevation has a lot less to do with how mountainous an area is and more to do with your proximity to the continental divide. Mount Washington in New Hampshire, for example, is just as big and imposing as any mountain in the Rockies or the Sierras, but its elevation is so much lower given the fact that it's on the East Coast, very far away from the continental divide. I think the topographical map of Kansas highlights this really well. Even though the state appears completely flat as you're driving through it, your elevation is constantly increasing as you move from east to west. A fun little side fact is that Colorado is actually also one of the most tornadic states in America, getting just as many tornadoes on average as Nebraska every year, and getting more tornadoes than most of the southern states. But people don't really associate tornadoes and flatness with Colorado. However, severe thunderstorms are really common there and throughout Wyoming because you've got those pressure systems coming in from both the north and the south, colliding on the eastern side of the continental divide and creating lots of convection that leads to severe storms. So Alaska has the most mountains. Colorado has the highest mean elevation, but which US state is the most densely covered with mountains? Well, that title would probably have to go to West Virginia. Maybe. It's complicated. So West Virginia is the only US state that's entirely contained within the Appalachian mountain range. The Appalachians span from the northeast end of the St. Lawrence River all the way down to northern Alabama. However, Appalachia is in many many ways more a cultural region than it is necessarily a geological one. The people who live along this corridor tend to live in very densely forested and hilly areas that are rural and both physically and economically cut off from the rest of the United States. In fact, most of the theories around the term redneck originate from this region, and a lot of isolated cultures like the Amish have been able to continue to survive and thrive because they exist predominantly within Appalachia. But just how mountainous is this area, really? Compared to the western part of the US, the Appalachians have significant flat and lowland regions, and people from the western states often criticize the Appalachians as being hills and not really mountains most of the time, which I personally disagree with, but I'm not here to argue semantics. However, when you look at a map of West Virginia, you see right away that the northwestern part of the state sits atop of plateau, and when you look at the skylines of cities in that part of West Virginia, there are no mountains to be seen on the backdrop. Which brings us to the case for Nevada. If you don't consider the plateau of western West Virginia to be mountains, then Nevada would actually be the US state most densely covered in mountains. The coverage here is pretty undeniable, with the Carson Sink and Death Valley being the only meaningfully flat parts of the state. But even so, when you're in those two areas, you still see large, prominent mountains off in the distance. But while most of those peaks in Nevada are pretty prominent, you're not going to find nearly as many over 10,000 feet in elevation as you would in, say, Colorado, Wyoming, or Utah because of its distance from the Continental Divide. And so Nevada's in a bit of a conundrum here. It doesn't have the most mountains, it ranks 5th in terms of mean elevation, and in terms of geological classifications, it's actually an amalgamation of lots of different small mountain ranges put together, as opposed to being just part of one big mountain range like West Virginia is. However, it is the best all-arounder, with the state's mean elevation still being pretty high, despite the fact that Nevada is home to Death Valley, one of the lowest elevation points on Earth. The state also has 2,000 named mountains, which is admittedly half of what Alaska has, but considering that Nevada is 3 times smaller than Alaska, this actually maths out to Nevada having more named mountains per capita. And quite frankly, there's not a single point in the entire state where you can spin in a circle and not see a mountain in front of you. And so while it isn't first in any particular area, if you were to mesh together the different interpretations of what mountainous means, then Nevada would end up having the strongest case of any US state. And actually, there are quite a few other states that come pretty close to Nevada too, depending on how you look at things. Like Hawaii is a volcanic archipelago, and so the state literally is mountains. But people tend to get weird when you refer to things like islands as mountains because they're kind of their own thing, and there are technically a lot of flatland parts of Hawaii as well where people are actually living. Utah is probably the closest contender because it's also very densely covered in mountains, while also having a higher mean elevation than Nevada. But there is a pretty big swath of flatland in the northwestern part of the state because of the Great Salt Lake and the Salt Flats. That being said, I would personally argue that Utah is the state where mountains are the most significant reality of actually living there. Almost all of Utah's population either lives in extremely tall mountains or within 5 miles of them, and so Utahns tend to be overwhelmingly mountain people in a way that residents of other places like Denver or Las Vegas kind of aren't. And then finally, we've got California too as a pretty strong contender. The state is extremely mountainous and is even home to the highest mountain in the lower 48, despite also being home to Death Valley and going all the way down to sea level. However, the Central Valley of California just knocks it out of the running because that swath of flatland is just too big compared to other states like Nevada and Utah. So I want to hear from you. Which state do you consider to be the most mountainous in the US? And which definition of mountainous do you think matters the most to you? Let me know in the comments below because I have a legitimately hard time deciding. And if you made it this far in the video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing if you are new. It helps me out a ton, and I will see you in the next one.